Hello and welcome to Geek History Lesson. I am Jason, watching the Bat Signal Inman.
I am Ashley Victoria Robinson. Welcome to your Mind University, because you have stumbled onto the podcast where we take one character, construct, or list from popular culture and teach you everything you need to know about them in about an hour. And today we are returning to our very, very popular list series with a good friend and returning to the podcast.
Yes, that's correct. We did a team-up episode with the Comic Source podcast about a year ago.
Sounds about right, yeah.
Yes, and we have brought back the excellent host because so many people of you out there really responded to our top 5 Superman artists, so we are now going to recreate that, except with Batman. We're going to decide the top 5 Batman artists with the host, the excellent host of the Comic Source podcast, Jace Milam. Jace, welcome back.
Hey man, thanks for having me. It's really great. We had a lot of fun doing the Superman list. It was hard to narrow it down to 5. Batman's a little different dynamic, so this is going to be a lot of fun. I'm going to enjoy to hear what you guys have to say about your top 5 and just comparing Superman artists versus top 5 Batman artists and just how the dynamic just felt so different to me.
Yeah, I'm really excited. Geek History Lesson and the Comic Source podcast has teamed up again. We are actually recording in the Comic Source home base. That is why Jace has an amazing sounding voice right now, because he's on his amazing mic and we're on our travel mics. But you are correct, sir. This is a completely different ball game than the Superman artist. And I got to be honest here, guys. I thought this list was harder. This list was way harder to determine than the Superman artist, because with Superman, I thought there were so many people, and I kept having to be like, oh no, I got to get rid of them. Oh no, I got to get rid of them. For this one, I thought, I don't know, maybe it's because of the character, and I'd love if we discuss this real quick. I thought it's maybe harder for an artist to leave a distinctive mark on Batman. Ashley, what do you feel about that?
Well, I wasn't part of the Superman episode.
That's correct.
So I can't really speak to the comparison between the two, but I didn't find this difficult at all, so I don't know what you guys are talking about. Like, I knew I had about 8 people right away, so I didn't really have much of a problem narrowing it down to 5, but apparently it's harder for the men on the podcast.
Yes.
Well, you know, Superman's my favorite character. That might play into it a little bit. And the other thing that I thought about was that, you know, when you think about Superman over the years, I don't think the character has had as much change in tone as Batman has. When I look at my list for my favorite Batman artists, so many of them are from a more modern time, say from the 70s forward, as opposed to Superman, where we're going back to the very beginning, and I can think of some iconic artists. You know, Batman, he was dark when he first started. He was really, an avenging vigilante. He used a gun, so different than those middle years where it got kind of campy. And then really when you start talking about Neal Adams in the 70s is really kind of the modern Batman that we think of, where from that point forward, I feel like the tone's been pretty consistent. So when I look at, iconic Batman artists, I really kind of start in that era, that 70s era, where they were trying to leave the campiness of the 60s TV show behind and moving forward. So I feel like in a way there was a smaller period of time to pull for me. You know, I can't really think of any, to me, again, just personally, I can't really think of any iconic Batman artists from before that time that really jump out in my mind.
Well, I mean, the only one that I will say that really stands out for me, and is a person that did not make my list, is Jerry Robinson, who is who I've told the story on Geek History Lesson once before, that I actually got to meet my very first San Diego Comic-Con right before he passed. But anyways, listeners out there, this is our opinion of our top 5. This is not the objective best. So there is no right, there is no wrong. This is all personal preference. This is all subjective. And if you would like to tell us your top 5 lists, Ashley, where should they do that on social media?
They can do that at geekhistorylesson.com, facebook.com/geekhistorylesson, or on Twitter at GHL Podcast. Respond to any of our posts there. We're always looking forward to seeing your opinions, especially on the list episodes. Yeah, lots of ways to contact us.
All right, cool. So let's begin with our number 5. Ashley, who is your 5th best, but not 5th best in your heart, Batman artist?
So my number 5 on this list is a modern artist, is somebody who has drawn a lot of different titles that I've liked, and is maybe most known for drawing a Batman character that I really dislike. but I think that his style is so clean and so modern, and honestly, like what I would like a superhero house style to look like. I think he's who a lot of people should be aiming for, and that is Mr. Patrick Gleeson.
Whoa.
Friend of the pod, friend of the Comic Source pod. Just in the interest of full disclosure, he's probably most well known for doing the Damian era stuff before moving on to Super Sons during Rebirth. But what I like most about Patrick is that every character has a different body type, and that's something that you don't see a lot of in comic books, particularly in superhero comics. I'm not trying to judge people necessarily on realistic anatomy unless it's a really disproportioned woman, and then I feel some kind of way about that. But I really admire that each member of the Bat family looks physically different. Bruce looks different than Dick. Dick looks different than Jason. Jason looks different than Tim, on and on down the line to the unmentionable son. And that allows very subtly to tell us what they're all good at. And there's a rule that Matt Groening, actually creator of The Simpsons and Futurama and 1,000 other great things, said that you should be able to identify each character by their silhouette. That's one of his rules of cartooning. That's really hard when most of your characters are not wearing cowls. And sometimes when you see the Bat family in shadow, you can only really tell who's Batman and maybe who a Batgirl is. And I think Patrick really gives them each an individual silhouette that goes with their very distinctive personalities. I think that's something that's lacking in a lot of other modern artists. And I think he's a perfect mixture of like a throwbacky, more cartoony face with a more modern active sensibility. I just love everything he draws. So again, when I was making up this list, like he was on my short list right away. I think Patrick Gleeson is awesome.
Yeah, awesome. That's a great choice. I would not have predicted Patrick Gleeson making it, or excuse me, him making it into this list. So that's awesome.
Well, I got your back.
That's great. He's very cool. He's a very cool dude. Jace, who would be your number 5?
All right, so my number 5 is probably for me the definitive Batman artist when I think of reading Batman comics during high school in the 90s. And he had such a long run and such a distinctive style, and I think for a lot of people around my age, he's probably who they think of when they think of Batman depicted, and it's Norm Breyfogle.
Yeah.
Lovely.
Moody, his use of shadow. Batman was so often backlit, and he also embraced getting a little abstract at times, with Batman looming, and he would be really tall, and the ears were always sticking up, and he would just show up as just this black, menacing figure to strike fear in the hearts of criminals. And so for me, he's who I think of when I think of that era of Batman after the '89 Tim Burton movie, when he really kind of blew up in pop culture. So I think for a lot of people, when they think of a Batman artist and the visuals are picturing in their head, they may not know the name, but it's Norm Breyfogle that they're picturing.
People might be surprised that Norm Breyfogle is actually, he has a lot more Batman artwork on commercial items than you realize. Like
Jose Garcia Lopez for Wonder Woman. Yeah, it's very much like that.
Yeah, like generally, like when there is a brand new Batman t-shirt at Walmart, or there is a Batman t-shirt or lunchbox, it is either Jose Garcia Lopez or Norm Breyfogle, I find. Generally, those seem to be the two images they seem to pick, besides Jim Lee.
Besides the Jim Lee New 52 Justice League art.
Yes, exactly. All right. My number 5 is sort of not really a dark horse choice, but a choice that I think a lot of people would not put on this list. But he has drawn Batman comic books, and I have his bibliography written down. Bruce Timm is my number 5. That is because Bruce Timm...
He almost made my list.
...literally defined the 90s style of Batman. The square-jawed version of the Dark Knight, the triangle eyes, the barrel-chestedness of Batman. And, again, he drew several issues of the Batman Adventures, which was the Batman tie-in book to his own series, the Batman animated series. And also he did a very famous Batman black and white. But to me, you cannot think about Batman in the 20th century without acknowledging Bruce Timm and his visual distinctive design to the character. I mean, I realize, again, a lot of people probably would give me crap because they're like, well, he's not really a technical comic book artist, but he did draw Batman comic books, so to me, he counts. And I think he definitely deserves to be in this conversation.
Yeah.
He was one of my alternates. I almost put him on my list as well. I mean, this is top 5 Batman artists. We didn't say comics specifically, but the other thing about it is, you know, he's so responsible for the look of that Batman the Animated Series.
Yes.
His sensibility and the way it looks, and that cartoon is so iconic, and it was such a gateway. I personally know of 10, if not more, people who that's how why they got into reading comics, because of that cartoon. So great choice. I'm glad one of us had Bruce Timm on the list.
Yeah, he was like my number 6. He was my also ran as well.
All right, Ashley, who would you pick as your number 4?
My number 4 is another contemporary artist, and I spent a lot of time actually thinking about modern age Batman artists because I wanted to make sure that the people I included either did something unique or changed Batman, because Batman's design has remained fairly standard for a long time, kind of like Wonder Woman's, kind of like Superman's. And so to be able to do something really unique and different, and then also to be able to do that from a meta perspective, is what led me to my number 4. And I wanted to make sure I got a woman on this list. So, like, it had to be the woman who draws the sexiest men in comics. It's Nicola Scott.
Nicola Scott, okay.
Mm-hmm. Quick sidebar. Nicola Scott, even though she wasn't on an ongoing title, drew one of my favorite images of Tim Drake of all time, who's my favorite member of the Bat family. So that stands out. But she also drew the New 52 Earth 2 series, which is one of the most modern, really different takes on Batman that is to my taste. I know everyone is screaming about Dark Knight Metal. I don't like that design, so it didn't make it onto my list. And I think the Earth 2 design is such an intelligent twist on the classic color palette of Batman. It's an intelligent twist on the character from a writing perspective. And then she also has an incredible cover for Detective 1000. That's Batman through the ages and all the different designs. Not only when you look at that cover can you tell that she understands from an artistic, technical perspective what is different and special about all the different eras of Batman, but even though they are largely the same, they all appear individual. And I just think from a design standpoint that is unsung, and I don't know if people appreciate the level of talent and detail that has to go into that, and that's why she did it for Action 1000, Detective 1000. She has a Wonder Woman version of that and a Robin version of that cover, and that's why people respond to it, because it is so well designed and so well executed. And then also because, like, she is out there doing it for the ladies where Nightwing is concerned, and I have mad love and respect for that. So she also not only redefined Batman in a modern era, but she kind of redefined the way we look at Nightwing and sexualized the male character, which is not something that you see a lot in comic books, so much so that that's a defining characteristic of that.
Yeah, Nightwing's butt.
Yeah, and he's kind of our secondary modern Batman, so I had to put Nicola Scott on there. I love the way she draws Batman.
I believe that Robin story you're talking about happened in the Legends of the Dark Knight.
Yeah, because
series.
she's never worked on a Batman title, but she did do Earth
DC,
2.
For shame.
Truly.
The other funny thing about Earth 2 you bring up is that she actually designed 2 Batman costumes, because the original Batman in Earth 2 dies in the first issue, and then there's a secondary Batman that shows up that's a mystery of who that is, and she could design that Batman costume.
The one with the cool red highlights. And red is my favorite color, so that really speaks to me. And also, they translated into the most amazing action figures that when I met Jason.
Those Batman. Every Earth 2 action figure.
He was like, you gotta look at these. Yeah, so she was another no-brainer. I knew I wanted to put her on the list. Even though, kind of like you said, we said Batman artists. Didn't say it had to be ongoing in a Batman title or anything like that. So, like, I knew I wanted to include her.
Jace, who would be your number 4?
My number 4 is an artist whose work I love. One of my favorite guys working in the industry today, and a super nice guy as well. But the reason I put him on my list is because he sort of has done for Batman what a lot of the Marvel characters have seen with looking more realistic. A lot of the Marvel comics have borrowed heavily from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, with Captain America's costume looking more realistic, and this artist
they're just drawing Chris Evans now.
Right, exactly. and Robert Robert Downey Jr. and the costumes aren't so crazy. It's like, okay, what if we took this idea of a superhero and actually had them wearing materials that we would see, in the real world, and it's Lee Bermejo. And you look at his Batman, specifically, I fell in love with his version of Batman in the Noel graphic novel that he did.
Like
Unsung collection, by the way, not as celebrated as it deserves to be.
100%.
Great.
100%. And then most recently, this last year, he did with Brian Azzarello the Batman Damned series, which I think is some of the
book.
Yes, exactly. And
disappointing.
And it's so I've talked to Lee about this. It so bothered me as such a fan of his that I think that whole controversy and nonsense overshadowed what I think is the best work of his career. And so if you have never seen Lee Bermejo's Batman, do yourself a favor, check out Noel, check out Batman Damned. It's so visceral. It gives you a sense of realism that you don't get in an everyday, more superhero centric fantasy, if you will, Batman comic. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. I love those books, but when you want to talk about, okay, if Batman existed in the real world, what would his costume actually look like? It's Lee Bermejo. So visceral with the blood that he does and the realism, the texture, the bruises. I could not put him on my list. I mean, yeah, he's a friend and I'm a fan of his art overall, but he truly does deserve to be on this list. Incredible Batman artist.
I like that you mentioned texture because I think that is something that's really overlooked, but when people see it and they recognize it, it really does help to ground what we consider to be a street level character, even though Batman is like in no way something that we could ascribe to being.
Yeah.
So Jason, what's your number 4?
My number 4 is who I believe the first artist to ever bring Batman into the modern age. That is, I'm going to badly mispronounce his name, David Mazzucchelli. Or Mazzucchelli? I'm not certain how you say it.
Good choice.
He, of course, drew only 4 issues of Batman. Batman 404 to 407, the famous storyline known as Batman Year One. Now, David worked with Frank Miller and Denny O'Neil on some Daredevil comics, especially specifically Born Again, which is one of the greatest Daredevil storylines of all time. And that's the reason why Miller brought him along to do Batman Year One. And it's funny, you talk about texture. To me, the thing that stands out about David Mazzucchelli's work on Batman is he makes the costume look simple, which also makes it look very real. And the shots of Batman in Batman Year One, even though Batman Year One is a Commissioner Gordon story more than it is a Batman story, every time you see Batman, it looks, the way he draws that costume, it makes it look very, very real to me. It makes it look very simple. It makes it kind of look like tights more than any other Batman artist I ever think. And to me, also, seeing the storyline in 1988 really was, to me, the first time in the modern Batman books that Batman looked modern. He stopped looking like he did in the Silver Age, because throughout most of the 80s they still drew him like George Perez did. They still drew him like a lot of Neal Adams did, and they made him Silver Age. And this is the first storyline where I was like, oh, we're getting crazy with the art, we're getting crazy with the colors, we're getting crazy with the simplicity of Batman and the strength and thickness of his lines. And also, this is one of the first Batman storylines where I noticed that Batman a lot of times was just black. He was in the shadows, and you only saw his eyes or his silhouette or his cowl, which I thought really, really stood out to me. So that's why David Mazzucchelli is definitely my number 4.
Nice.
Yeah, a great choice. I think he was on my list of alternates as well. I think when you talk about the fact he only did those 4 issues and how impactful it is, because there are so many Batman creators who look to that for inspiration, and they compare even artists that come on Batman now, like Jorge Fornes, who's worked with Tom King. And what Tom says is, it's harkening back to what Mazzucchelli did and the simplicity of it, which gave it so much impact.
Yes. Again, like, it is, to me, like, that was a definite, he was always going to be in my list, because for his limited work on Batman, people still talk about it.
It's an all-time great Batman story.
Yeah, it's an all-time great Batman story that people are still talking about.
Still in print.
It's still in print. Actually, they're doing like a brand new hardcover version of it.
They
this
did
year.
an animated movie based on it.
So, Ashley,
yes.
Who is your number 3?
It's interesting that you brought up Gordon with your number 4, because my number 3 artist also did a very Gordon-centric Batman run. They are who I think as of as the definitive Bronze Age Batman artist, blue, big cape, big ears, Jim Aparo. I think I would have been remiss not to put him on this list. And for me, he very much defines this transitionary look between the Silver Age and then what we think of as being like a 90s or a more contemporary modern Batman. He has a lot of staples that I really like. Like, I love a big cape. I love big ears. It's very moody. It's not as classically gothic as like a Norm Breyfogle, but I think he's in that same kind of school of creators. He worked on Nightfall, he worked on Contagion, he worked on Road to No Man's Land, he worked with Len Wein.
Yeah, Nightfall is how I remember Jim Aparo.
Yeah. So not only is, I think, the art very iconic, and when you go and you see a lot of comic book covers that they recreate on like those pieces of tin that you can hang on your wall, a lot of it is this Bronze Age Jim Aparo art. I think it is very influenced by Super Friends, and I think he's an artist that people are more familiar with than maybe they think they are from the merchandising, even if they're not as well read and as well versed. But if you read anything that was really big out of that 80s and 90s Batman kind of transitionary zeitgeist, right when things were getting a little more darker, a little more intense, he's probably the person who penciled it. And I think his art is featured and homaged on the Bronze Age Batman omnibus cover as well. And I love that he embraced that Silver Age look where he's not Bat God yet. He's not super jacked. He still looks like a human being, but in a silhouette or against a really, really cool arc of lightning, he's still kind of scary. So I think Jim Aparo, he's my favorite Bronze Age Batman artist. This is my number 3.
He also, I was going to say, the other thing I remember about Jim Aparo is he always draws lots of hair on the chest of Batman.
Yeah.
It's always interesting to see what artists give Batman a hairy chest.
He's the artist of one of the Batman Ra's al Ghul collections.
Yes.
And Batman's arms and his upper thighs as well are all very hairy, which George Perez does as well, especially when Robin, Dick Grayson, gets a little older, gets very hairy. You know, I stand a hairy Batman. I can get behind that.
That's fine.
I think of Aparo as the definitive artist for Batman and the Outsiders as well, because he drew that series.
Pull.
And he is, other than Breyfogle, he would be when I picture the way Batman's supposed to look in a comic, Aparo is who I'm picturing.
With a blue cowl?
Yeah, with a blue cowl, of course.
Chase, who is your number 3?
So my number 3 is somebody you talk about defining the modern era, and I mentioned him earlier. It's Neal Adams. You know, when it came time to make Batman a little more serious, pull him out of that idea that he was this campy superhero Adam West TV show kind of thing. Neal Adams is really the one that sort of redefined who Batman was, and it wasn't just that. He was more moody and he was more dark, and they got away from the silliness of the 60s with the rainbow-colored Batman and the zebra Batman and that kind of thing. It was also, he was one of the first artists that really paid attention to musculature and anatomy and really made that the forefront, and it came across on the page, and he really sort of ushered in a new look, not only for Batman, but really for modern superhero comics. And so I don't know that his style has aged the best, and I don't know that his later work has as much impact. But for the time, he was sort of the perfect artist to come along and show us a serious side to Batman again. And I think that eventually led into things that Frank Miller did and some of the other later Batman artists. But I mean, Neal Adams, when you think about some of the iconic covers he's done, not just for Batman, you talk about the hairy-chested Batman.
Yeah,
he's got that cover where Ra's is walking off and he's laying there shirtless, full hairy chest in full view. But also things like the Green Arrow, Green Lantern, the Speedy cover, that's iconic. And so
My Ward, a junkie?
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that, again, when you talk about definitive Batman artists, it wouldn't be a complete list without Neal Adams.
I mean, the cues at his booth at Comic-Con alone, I think, would back up your choice. All right, Jason, what is your number 3?
So we've mentioned a lot of people that have, to me, just drawn Batman in very normal ways. Normal proportions, normal arms, normal legs. My number 3 is a guy who I think broke that mold and allowed a lot of other artists past him to really exaggerate the Dark Knight. And that is Tim Sale. Tim Sale is my number 3.
I love Tim Sale.
I know you do.
So much.
Lovely that we got to meet him last year.
Amazing
he
human.
Was lovely
Amazing.
in person as well, which was a great love. So Tim Sale, classic. He introduced watercolors to Batman before Jim Lee did it in Hush. And, when he draws a person, he does not draw them to normal proportions. His Batman has a very, pea head, ears that are 10 feet long.
The best.
Giant arms, but then he's always, hunched over like a bat.
And Robin is teeth.
And then when you see his Joker has, 5 million teeth in his mouth.
I hate it. It's the scariest Joker I've ever seen.
So
I hate
he started doing some really gothic proportions to Batman, and I think up until that point of the Long Halloween of the 90s, again, we were all following this model of Neal Adams, and for as much dynamic range that Neal Adams brings to Batman, he still draws Batman like a normal dude.
It's still in the mold.
Still a normal dude. All of these artists, I think, so far, Jim Aparo, Lee Bermejo, because of course he came later, I think is the only exception to our list so far, but I think Tim Sale is the one who broke the glass and said no, we can draw these superheroes in over-exaggerated poses. The way he draws the Scarecrow, it looks like a scarecrow. It doesn't look like a human being anymore. And I think that for a character like Batman, it really helped. And I kind of think it really helped the storytelling of The Long Halloween and, of course, Dark Victory, the sequel. But again, then also you have to think about how much shadow and darkness Tim Sale brought into these stories and still made them amazing.
Well, Tim Sale, if people don't know, is colorblind.
Yeah.
So, obviously works with a colorist, as many artists do, but I think that's the reason why he plays with light and dark so well. And I want to jump in because Tim Sale's my number 1.
Oh.
And longtime listeners to this podcast, I've said it but for 5 years that he's my favorite Batman artist of all time. I think he's incredible. I'm going to say something that's going to sound like an insult, but I hope that intelligent listeners understand that it's a compliment. Tim Sale draws ugly people, and I love it. All the denizens of Gotham are weird and out of proportion, and the female mob boss in Long Halloween is this bridge of a woman, and she's scary and she holds her own, and you understand why she can hold court with all of these men and she's not the least bit threatened. And I live for the way he draws Robin. Robin is so little and he has pointy knees and he's all sharp. It's just like a little kid.
And his
Robin
Superman looks like a thumb.
I love it. He's got no neck. He does look like a thumb. Robin tornadoes in and out of the scenes that he's in, which is just the way a little kid operates. And I love long-eared Batman because for a long time before Bluetooth and before the internet, I used to like to think that there was a radio transmitter in there, and that was how he used to talk to Oracle.
And his CB radio, truckers.
I loved it. But there's something, even though I use the word ugly, there is something very fantasy and fairy tale quality to his art. I've always just found it to be the most magical Batman art I've ever seen. And the first 2 absolutes that Jason ever gave me were Long Halloween and Dark Victory. So
Okay, Ashley, Tim Sale is your number 1. He's my number 3, but we need to find out who your number 2 is. So who do you think is the second greatest, best Batman artist of all time?
my number 2 Batman artist is a lovely Canadian who I would say is actually probably more well known for his work on Catwoman, but it is Darwin Cook.
Whoa, great choice.
That is a great pick.
Thank you. I think Darwin Cook, as a modern artist, along with Bruce Timm, really redefined what we think of as being Batman, because he is cartoony and he is very throwbacky to the golden age in that way. And if you're familiar with what is it, Frontier? I keep wanting to say Final Frontier. New Frontier. Thank you so much. If you're familiar with the New Frontier, it's a really interesting re-examination of DC original superheroes against the backdrop of the real world. And I love that he embraces the original Batman cowl, which is a little weird and a little more animalistic compared to the sleeker designs of some of the other artists that we've spoken about, but he still manages to make it feel cool, and it still really works for the world that it's set against. I think Darwin Cook is also an artist that a lot of people sleep on because it is cartoony and broader and a little more throwbacky, and I think he's someone that deserves to be celebrated a little more than he is. So I would really encourage people to go look at New Frontier, to go look at everything he did. He did a lot of Justice League stuff.
Well, I'm going to suggest, I've talked about this in the podcast before, a Batman title that a lot of people sleep on is a miniseries that was written and drawn by Darwin Cook, Batman Ego.
I was just going to bring up Ego as well. Also, because he draws the entire Bat family and a running theme that I think people have noticed throughout my commentaries. I like artists who do the whole Bat family because that's what I like best about Batman is all the variety of characters. But I just think Darwin Cook is so beautiful and manages to embrace what was special about Batman when he was first created and through the ages in a way that I think some modern artists are looking a little more to the future. And I feel like Darwin Cook definitely had one foot in Batman's future and Batman's past. And maybe it's because I grew up in the 90s, so cartoon Batman feels very safe and familiar to me.
Yeah.
And so the fact that his work references and by the way, he is responsible for the Batman Beyond title sequence.
Yep, he animated
so that's like an indelible mark that he's made on Batman in two different mediums.
It's a good pick. Yeah, that's a good choice.
I think he's someone who should be looked to. So Darwin Cook is my number 2.
I think one of the things about Darwin Cook that people don't realize, and if you do get a chance to go check out some of his work, it becomes so impactful, and I think they can't even necessarily put their finger on what it is, but he does subtle things like you were talking about with the cowl, making it more animalistic.
Yeah, the ears are huge.
Yeah, and he tells a story with just stylistically the way he draws his characters.
Yes.
It's not necessarily storytelling in terms of transitions from panel to panel or movement. Right away you're getting an impact just from the unique way he draws the characters. It adds so much to the story. I think it's why he's a super underrated creator and gone from us far too soon.
He's also responsible for so many amazing Batman variant covers.
Oh yeah.
Yes, yeah. He's probably much more known as a cover artist because even toward the end of his life and the end of his career, because he was working all the way up to the end, he did this incredible series that covers across the DC line, and the Teen Titans cover they're in a band, and it's like one of my favorite variants.
Yeah, and I think the Detective Comics one, it's Batman and Robin like driving the Silver Age Batmobile.
Yes, yeah.
So
yeah, the Batgirl one, or she's riding her motorcycle. And most of them are landscape.
Yes,
they're not portrait.
Which
I
is
believe
uncommon.
the Superman one is Superman and Lois having a picnic.
And she's reclining against him.
Yeah, which is really good.
He also draws some of the most beautiful women in comics.
Yes,
definitely.
Yes, true femme fatales.
Absolutely.
And speaking of femme fatales, Jace, what is your number 2?
All right, my number 2 is who I consider to be the best Batman artist currently working on Batman today.
Okay.
He's got a series coming out hopefully soon with Jeff Johns that many people are anxiously awaiting, called The Three Jokers. Just incredibly dynamic, really came on gangbusters on Detective Comics, and then did a lot of the work on Batman Eternal, certainly a lot of the covers. Probably my favorite image of Jim Gordon of all time that he did for a cover of Batman Eternal, which I think they also used for all the house ads.
I know exactly what cover you're talking about.
It's awesome. And it's Jason Fae Buck.
Yeah.
Absolutely dynamic artist. And when you talk about line work, you talk about precision, you talk about figures and the action-packed Batman fighting scenes jumping off the page. Jason is who I think of. He also had a really iconic run on Justice League with Jeff Johns for the Darkseid War. Batman in the Mobius chair. Absolutely incredible, iconic images of Batman in a different way. You want to talk about Bat God. Here's Batman with the powers of Metron. So Jason, I almost put him as my number 1. He was so close, but I definitely had to have him on my list and really high up. Incredible Batman artist. Last year, 2018 at New York Comic Con, he was there. Jeff Johns was there. They were on stage. They did a Batman panel, and they showed a lot of the images that are going to be in the upcoming Three Jokers. He got to redesign a Batmobile. His 3 Jokers look all distinctive from different eras. So I know a lot of people are looking forward to that title, and I had to put Jason on my list. Really very powerful.
He always reminds me of sort of a modern Gary Frank.
Yeah,
is kind of what he was like.
Interesting.
Yeah, because he has like similar styles, but he's very dynamic. Like, everything he draws, like, it just pops and it has an energy and stuff like that. So, and speaking of energy, my number 2 is someone we've already said on this list, but I wanted to talk about him. And my second favorite Batman artist of all time is Norm Breyfogle.
Ooh.
That is my second, because a lot of people don't realize this, but Norm did an amazing run on Detective Comics with Alan Grant, the writer, and they
sometimes people sleep on Detective Comics.
They do,
just as a series,
and
which
a lot
is
of
a
times,
real bummer.
It's the better series. Norm Breyfogle designed the ventriloquist. He is responsible for that.
I didn't know that.
And also Norm Breyfogle is also responsible for, I think, defining the look of your favorite Robin, Tim Drake.
You're absolutely right.
It is Norm Breyfogle. Also, Mr. Zaz is a Norm Breyfogle creation. So when I think about Norm Breyfogle, like with the pointy, like cape scallops, like he was the one that introduced these dynamic. He to me was the last artist to make the blue and gray Silver Age Batman costume look cool, look scary, look modern, dynamic, and I loved it when I think of Batman. And when you ask me, like, oh man, like, what's the most famous Batman cover of all time? The cover that comes into my head is a 90s cover where it is Batman and Robin caught in the spotlight, and it's Tim Drake Robin.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think everybody does, because I know, sadly, Norman Breyfogle passed away in 2018, and I saw that image shared in all the DC house ads. That's the cover they picked. And to me, again, when I think Batman, I think Norm Breyfogle. Like, that's the one, and that's why I wanted to, of course, give him one last shout-out before we moved on.
Nice.
Yeah, one other thing I'll say about Norm, it wasn't just the mood that he set with his Batman and how gothic, I think Ashley mentioned that before. It was also, he drew an incredible Batcave, he drew an incredible Batmobile.
He's a great designer.
And they also had that supporting character at that time in the comics, Harold.
Yes.
And he was great, because Harold was a mute.
Yep.
And Norm always did such a great job conveying emotion, so you knew what Harold was thinking and feeling. So yeah, super underrated, not just Batman artist, but just artist overall.
Yes. All right. So Ashley, we know your number one is Tim Sale.
Totally passed away. He's the best.
Jace, who is your number one best Batman artist of all time?
So I can't believe that nobody's mentioned this. I was worried somebody was going to mention him sooner, and I'm surprised we haven't had.
We know.
I almost made that joke earlier.
Honestly, I think
all respect to Rob Liefeld, who is a very nice man, and we love his art, but he's not really well known for Batman.
No, definitely not. But I can't believe we haven't had more overlap, which is great. I always worry about that when we do these kind of episodes. But my number one is Marshall Rodgers.
Oh.
Iconic Batman artist, really, in my mind, the first Batman artist who made the cape kind of its own living thing. And other artists have kind of played off of that, probably Aparo a little bit, also Kelly Jones did that a lot. But for me, Marshall Rodgers was the first one who really, he would draw the cape out of proportion. He would draw it so big that Batman couldn't possibly walk wearing this cape. It would be like a bridal train. It was so big. But beyond that, he also drew Batman in action, more so, I feel like, than a lot of the artists that came before him. He was always jumping off of buildings or, in the middle of leaping and that flowing cape out behind him, and still embracing that look of the blue and gray Batman, but great line work and kind of a little bit ahead of his time in that so many other artists working at that time, everything was kind of a superhero style and kind of realistic. And much like Tim Sale, he was one that kind of broke the mold a little bit and was willing to play with proportions and play with light and shadow, and certainly play with the cape and make it its own thing, and is responsible for a lot of iconic covers and Batman imagery from the late 70s and early 80s. So he had to be my number one, just based on the fact that when you look at Batman, you think about who he is as a character, the silhouette in the shadows and the cape are such an indelible part of the visual of Batman. And I feel like Marshall Rodgers is the first one that started to kind of elevate that and push that to the forefront. And I think a lot of artists that have come after, maybe without even realizing, draw on a lot of the things that he was sort of the first one to start doing.
Interesting. All right, Jason. So we have two people, Tim Sale and Marshall Rodgers, who pushed proportions. So let's see who you're going to add to our cadre of top Batman artists with your number one.
I will say my number one choice when he first started drawing Batman did draw him out of proportion and then slowly got it under control over the course of his first 12 issues. I'm going to get a lot of flack for this choice. And
it's your opinion. It's not wrong.
I don't care from you all, internet, because this is my choice. a lot of people need to remember that in the 90s, Batman was not the best-selling title at DC Comics.
What?
And then in the mid-2000s, a certain artist came onto Batman and skyrocketed Batman to the #1 best-selling DC comic, a position that it has almost held for almost 15 years. Now, other titles beat it, but it is usually Batman, the singular title Batman comic book series, is usually the best-selling, highest-selling DC comic book every month. My favorite Batman artist of all time is Jim Lee. Now, Jim Lee is one of my favorite pencilers of all time. I do try to buy like everything that Jim Lee draws. I just think there is something about his style. Ever since, he left Marvel Comics in 1992 to form Image, there's something about Jim Lee's style that like shouts out to me that I'm like, this is amazing. And then when you combined it with Batman in 2003 for Batman Hush and that Jeff Loeb run, one of the best Batman runs of all time, but like I bought those single issues. At that time, I did not care about Batman at all time. Like I was like, Batman's fine, Batman's cool. I'll read him every once in a while. But when they announced Jim Lee was on Batman, I was like, I'm back to being Weekly Comics again. I gotta buy it.
You have 2 Jim Lee Batman posters.
I do have 2 Jim Lee Batman posters. I have the Batman and Nightwing cover from Hush, and then I have the Batman and Robin cover from All-Star Batman and Robin because I think the nice symbology of the two of them together. But Jim Lee, I think, made the short-cowled Batman popular again. He made, at the time, he brought back the Batman Year One of only having the bat on the chest, not having the yellow oval. And also, I think he's the one that got us away from the Silver Age Batman belt of the little pellets and brought back the Frank Miller giant utility Year
Pouches.
One pouches, which I love. That's my favorite. Like, I want Batman's belt to look like it's like 50 pounds and gonna slide off his ass at any point.
I am actually glad that you put Jim Lee on your list. I think he absolutely deserves to be in contention and in the discussion. And I was like, man, if none of us puts Jim Lee on our list, the internet's going to come after it. I think people are going to agree with you. I don't think you're going to get flack for this at all.
Okay, well, just to me, I mean, if I were to pick who I think is the greatest working artist right now, and I know working is very loose for Jim Lee because he's very busy being
it's loose for a lot of
the
creators.
publisher. He's got a lot of stuff on his plate, but I do still think Jim Lee's the best artist out there right now. Like when Jim Lee gets to draw a book in between his infinitely busy schedule, he's amazing. He's so good, and that's why to me I'm like, Jim Lee has defined Batman in the last 20 years more than any other artist in the last 20 years. Like I don't think you can argue that. And again, just when you objectively look at how Batman Hush skyrocketed ever since Batman Hush, it has been like superstar team after superstar team after superstar team. Because I think Batman Hush made DC realize, like, oh, this is our blockbuster title. We've got to put the best people on this thing because it needs to be #1 time and time and time and time again. It is a murder's row of artist talent post Jim Lee to now, to current day. Like, there has never been an amazing artist on Batman since Jim Lee. And again, I just think when he first started drawing Batman, you can look at the first issue of Hush. His Batman is a monstrosity, is huge, but over the course of the run, it's so good. And I beg you, if you've never looked at the Absolute for Batman Hush, they have all these pages where they go through all the Easter eggs that Jim Lee puts in. My favorite one is in the issue where Harley Quinn invades the opera. Jim Lee drew himself, Jeff Loeb, and all of the X-Men attending the opera. And they're there. You can see them. But Jim Lee is just, there's something, he's a combination of all. He's detailed, he's cartoony, and he has energy. And he's a great storyteller. And that, to me, is why he's definitely the best Batman artist of all time for myself.
Nice.
Yeah, he was on my list as well.
He's on my short list, yeah.
Honorable mentions. I think the reason I didn't put him in my top 5 is because I agree with you. I think he's one of the most talented artists, if not the most talented artist working today. So I don't think of him as just a Batman artist. I know a lot of people do, and he's probably, since he first did Hush with Jeff Loeb, he's probably drawn Batman more than any other character.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
And yeah, his art is iconic. And if any of the listeners aren't aware, Jim Lee actually has a Twitch channel.
He does,
where he interacts with fans and he draws right there. He'll ask for suggestions of things to draw. So if you haven't had a chance to check it out, I highly encourage you, especially if you're an aspiring artist, because he'll answer questions about why he does certain things. People will ask, well, I need help doing shading.
He'll also let you submit your artwork, and like the next week around, he'll give you tips.
Yeah.
He'll be like, oh, you should adjust this. You should think about this.
He's also just a lovely person.
He's he's so nice.
Very nice man.
He's so nice. All right, great. I think this was a great list. Just let everybody out there listening to this right now, wherever you're listening to this, whether you're listening to this on the Comic Source or listening to this on the Geek Lesson podcast, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/Jawiin. That's Jawiin. And over there, every week, we do an extra episode called Geek History Lesson Extra. Jace will be joining us for that episode, and we're going to be talking about some of the other honorable mention Batman artists that didn't make it into our list, because we could talk about Batman artists till the cows come home, but we wanted to limit it to top 5 here. So everybody out there listening, if you're a fan of Geek History Lesson, don't forget you can listen to Geek History Lesson on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, all the places that podcasts are going to be found. Ashley, we've done best Superman artists. We've done best Batman artists. If they want to suggest future lists, where can they do that?
If you want to suggest best Wonder Woman artists, you can do that at geekhistorylesson.com, facebook.com/geekhistorylesson, or on Twitter at GHL Podcast. There's a bunch of ways to contact us in all of those places, and believe me, I read them all.
Jace, if they want to listen to your fine podcast, follow you on Twitter, get more of your thoughts on Marshall Rodgers, where can they find you, sir?
So you can Google the Comic Source. You're going to find me. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. It's always the Comic Source. Also, you can go to lrmonline.com. That is the site that I'm affiliated with. We cover all kinds of pop culture content, from movies, TV shows, comics, video games, all that kind of stuff. So weekly, you can find my podcast there, as well as at thecomicsourceblog.com.
Thank you again, Jace, for joining us, and thank you again for letting us do another crossover episode.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun.
You can follow me on Twitter at Jawiin, Jawiin. You can follow Ashley on Twitter at Ashley V. Robinson. And you can follow the podcast on Twitter at GHL Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, Gothamites. I have been Jason, I like the short ears, Inman.
I have been Ashley Victoria Robinson, and Professor Jason, would you please dismiss the class?
Class is dismissed, Gotham.